Hello, and welcome back to Policy Voices, the podcast from Friends of Europe. As always, I'm your host, Sabina Șancu, and this week on the podcast, we're going to take you a bit further away from the realm of geopolitics down on Earth, a topic that we often talk about in our podcast, and we're going to head into space. My very special guest this week is Ambassador Marjolijn van Deelen, who is the EU Special Envoy for Space. So I had the honor of going over to her office a few weeks ago in the EAS and chatting to her about the EU's position in space. Now, before we head into the conversation, allow me to wax poetic here, because whenever we think about space these days, we tend to look at it from the pop culture, Star Wars, Star Trek perspective. But I was recently reading the novel that won the Booker Prize in 2024, Orbital by Samantha Harvey. And that one's, the book's about 6 astronauts and cosmonauts who are in the International Space Station. And they're from all these different countries. They're from the US and Russia, Italy, the UK, and Japan. And they're kind of looking at the world from up there in the orbit as the continents rotate and rotate in all of these routes that they're doing over the course of 24 hours. And it makes them think about the families that they have down there. It makes them think about the fragility of human life and about how precious the world is. So before we get into the interview with Ambassador van Deelen, I'd like to read to you the first paragraph of the book. So Samantha Harvey writes, "Rotating about the Earth in their spacecraft, they are so together and so alone that even their thoughts, their internal mythologies, at times convene. Sometimes they dream the same dreams, of fractals and blue spheres and similar faces engulfed in dark, and of the bright, energetic black of space that slams their senses. Raw space is a panther, feral and primal. They dream it stalking through their quarters." I like to keep this spirit throughout the discussion, because even if space in this context feels like something very diplomatic, something very out of the realm of what we discuss, it's still something that can give us immense perspectives about the nature of our planet, the nature of our relationships on this planet, and what might be in store for our future. So without any further ado, let's move on to my interview with the EU Special Envoy for Space, Ambassador Marjolijn van Deelen. We'll start off with, let's say, the basics. So I know many people might not be familiar with what the EU does in regards to space. So I'm wondering if you could briefly introduce us to key approaches, pieces of legislation, and bodies involved in this.
I think many people know that the EU has a really first-class space program. Everybody will have heard of Galileo, which helps us with navigation. It's like GPS, but better and European. We have Copernicus that provides satellite images, free and open to everyone. And there's also a few other services like EGNOS for safe navigation for airplanes and ships. We have SST, that's Space Surveillance and Tracking. And the European Commission is also working hard for a new program, IRIS², which will allow us to have satellite communications secure through the EU space program. I work at the External Action Service. My boss is Kaja Kallas, the High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission. And our mandate is on elements of foreign and security policy, of defense policy, which are very much the domain of member states. So we look together with member states at the security elements of it. How can we use that space program for defense purposes? How can we keep it safe? How do we respond when there is a threat? So that is more the role that we have. Also internationally, we work a lot with partners, with third countries. So we do a lot of dialogues with them on space and space security, as well as work in the UN. Because the UN there's a big effort going on space. So that is something that we coordinate. So really there's this, I could say maybe triangle between the European Commission, the member states and ourselves.
To look at how this sector has grown, because just like every other branch of the EU, I'm sure that there's been developments. How would you compare the EU's activities towards space now compared to what they were like 20 years ago?
Yeah, those differences are huge. In the last decades, the EU has developed a state-of-the-art space program. So internationally, we are really one of the big players on space. So that's, I think, is a very significant achievement. At the same time, in those 20 years, we have seen the geopolitical environment deteriorate. We see a lot more threats in space. So we've really started thinking about security in space, which was not so much a thing 20 years ago. And with our strategy, a space strategy for security and defense, that's the moment where we had a paradigm shift, where we realized space is a strategic domain. That's how it's being used by countries. That's how it's being used by us, and not necessarily only the civilian use that we focused on 20 years ago.
And I'm curious about you personally, because before becoming EU Special Envoy for Space, you occupied a similar position, but in the domain of disarmament and non-proliferation. So I'm wondering what approaches and maybe lessons you took from that position into the space arena.
If you look at it, it's more logical than it might seem at first sight, because within disarmament and arms control, which has very much been focused on the nuclear for the last 50 years. We have very well established systems, treaties, regional arrangements that are either working or not working, but something that has been built over decades. And we can use that experience to try and do arms control to make sure that we stay secure and that we don't enter into an arms race. So that is actually the same question, only 5 decades later, in a different area. In the meantime, of course, a lot of other areas have developed arms control systems, if you want to call them like that, in the chemical weapons, but also in cybersecurity, for example. So this is a bit of a natural continuation for me. What is also very similar is the fact that both are geopolitics. Through a capacity or capability that is very important to countries, so that link to their core interests. And because of that, need these international agreements. And the same is true for space. A lot of countries have a core interest in gaining access or keeping access, or maybe even in dominating access to space. So there we see the same geopolitics playing out as we do on Earth. So that's another similarity that I see. And also, to some extent, the international network is similar, because very often you see people that have worked on non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, to also work on space issues. It's the same UN fora that we discuss in largely.
With this in mind, I'd want to really look at security issues. And from your perspective in this position, what would you say is the most pressing security concern that we have in space right now? I think people are aware of all the problems on Earth, but there's also so many things going on up there.
Yeah, that's the bad news. It's not just on Earth, but also in space. When I say space, I don't think about exploration to Mars or research on the universe. It's really about that layer of satellites that we have around Earth and how to make sure that we keep access to those satellites. That's what we look at. So if you think space, you may think far, far away from Earth, but it's actually very close to Earth in real terms. And what we see there is geopolitics playing out. We see a number of countries having developed capabilities to be able to attack other countries. Some have proven that they can shoot down a satellite. They have done such tests to shoot them down from Earth. But given the fact that this topic is so political and that technology has advanced so much, it's not always very clear. There's a lot of ambiguity in space on the behavior of a certain satellite? Is it coming too close to mine? Why is it coming so close? What is it doing? Why does it have an arm with which it can grab things? What is it going to do with that? So that also increases the threats that we perceive. So this uncertainty about all these assets out there in space. It's been very important for us to increase our understanding of those threats. So we've worked with our member states and their security services that would provide information to the Single Intelligence Center of the EU, SIAC, to build a common understanding of the threats. This is a classified document, so I can't talk about it here, but you will understand that there's a number of key threats that as EU that we face, and most of them come from either Russia or China. By their behavior in space. With that knowledge, we have, as EU, designated space as a strategic domain because it is so important to our societies. And that designation of strategic domain was done in the strategy that we have, the Space Strategy for Security and Defense, that came out 2 years ago. That really marks a turning point in how we see space now, much more strategically, much more at risk than we did before when we were much more focused on the civilian uses of it. And these two come together, of course, because the risks are so big because we depend on space services. You know, if nothing was out there, it wouldn't matter so much what other states were doing up there. But space services are so ingrained in everything that we do in our daily lives. You probably, or maybe you know Brussels very well, so you might not have used your maps to come here. But normally when you navigate, you use space services. Those are very well known, but there's in almost all sectors of our economies, for example, tractors in agriculture. They're all in Europe. 90% of the tractors get guided by satellite information. And through that, we've been able to really have much more precision farming and thereby reduce the amount of fertilizer that is being used and to be much more precise with the pesticides. And there's a lot of other sectors in which we use space. So if that were to be threatened, our societies would have a really big problem. Energy grids. They are synchronized and managed with space services, banking, space services. So for that reason, for societal resilience, it is key we keep this secure. Not just societies, also our security and defense. Of course, our armed services in our member states, they also rely heavily on the information they get through satellites, the communication they do through satellites. So that's another reason to keep it secure.
Yeah, I think back to, for instance, whenever we have floods or fires as well, that Copernicus, right, is the one that really helps us monitor what's going on in the areas.
Yeah, so that's really key for emergency services so that they can operate in the most effective way and efficient way possible, and that we can really fast in delivering aid and also in mitigating the natural disaster or whatever other emergency is taking place.
I'm curious about this security question in space and the interplay between publicly funded initiatives and private actors in the satellite sphere, how they interact, whether they aid each other or threaten each other.
Well, it's not a matter of hating or threatening each other, but indeed you see now a lot of commercial operators in space. They all have to comply with the laws and regulations of the countries that they launch from. Mm-hmm. So they're not fully independent actors. They need a permit to launch. They're bound by rules and regulations domestically, like boats in a way. And they have to comply with international law, which is applicable to outer space. So in that sense, they're not that different. But we've seen with much more companies being active in space and the technologies they have developed, space has become much more congested. So it's very important that states and companies work together in defining these rules of the road, because both have an interest, both from a different point of view. but these need to come together.
Yeah, I actually was interested in that aspect of congestion because I know it's a maybe neglected aspect of how we think about pollution. Could you tell me a bit more about how this congestion has come about and what its effects are?
Today, there's more than 13,000 satellites in orbit around Earth. That's a huge number, but space is big. If you add to that the fact that there's about 40,000 pieces of debris larger than 10 centimeters, so something that you can see pretty well, that is already a lot more. But then if you add up the pieces of debris that are smaller than 10 centimeters, you can just add another 130 million of pieces out there. With all that going around in orbits around Earth, the risk of collision is really increasing. And with that, very serious accidents can happen. And if there is a collision, of course, that will then create even more bits and pieces. But when they hit each other, they break apart. So that will only make things worse. So the EU is very focused on space traffic management and SST. And we are promoting that both in a multilateral context and through the EU space program.
Of course, many people know that there's a lot of tension between some of the biggest players in the world right now, and there's a lot of geopolitical divisions. Even looking back at history, when space collaboration brought us apart, but then brought us together, why is international collaboration in space more important now than ever? And how is Europe adapting its approach to global space partnerships?
It's more important now than ever because many more countries are interested in becoming spacefaring nations. It used to be only a handful, but now there's many, many more that are doing this. But also all other countries on Earth are now dependent on what I just talked about, all these services and data. The EU's data and services are available for free. So they're used in all countries around the world. So they all have a keen interest in making sure this stays both safe and secure. So that's why there's an increased need of international cooperation. As EU, we have a number of partnerships and strategic dialogues with a couple of countries specifically on space and on space security. But apart from that, we work with all countries in the context of the UN to see how we can work together to set some rules of the road in order to decrease these ambiguities that I just talked about. So that we avoid escalation in space. For example, if we see behavior of a satellite, don't know where it's going, and it's from a country with which we have an adverse relationship, we could overreact. So we wouldn't want that escalation in space. So that's why we need some sort of norms and rules and principles of responsible behavior in space. We are working towards that in the UN context with a few other countries has a leading role in promoting a very inclusive way of looking at that. So also including private sector, including all nations, even if they don't have space assets themselves, so that we can really have this comprehensive input on what will work. Because if it doesn't work, it doesn't make sense to agree on it in UN meeting rooms. There have been initiatives also to have more treaties in space, because what we have now is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, but that is really much more focused on not placing weapons of mass destruction in outer space. It's a cornerstone, but it's not sufficient for the needs of today. We think we will at some point get to further treaties, but treaty development takes a long time. And we've seen with almost all treaties that first you agree internationally on where you want to go, what your norms are, what your principles are, and work on the basis of those. And then that becomes a treaty text. Plus we want something that addresses our threats and the ideas that are currently out there, they don't. So that's why we're working so much on getting to that first step and also getting very quickly to agree on very tangible measures that we can take in order to keep our satellites safe.
It really comes across that the EU's activities in space are really important. And of course, just like with any of the EU's priorities, I'm wondering if space has remained important enough in the EU's budgetary planning in terms of funding sources and instruments that would help really reach these plans.
I think there's very good money reserved for space. You probably have seen the proposals for the new MFF, proposals by the Commission. The investments of the EU in the past decades have been billions of euros. Because these are investments that take a long time to mature. So towards the future, we'd also need to secure good budgets. It's not something that you switch on and off. But of course, I'm always happy to have more. Space is also, it's not just important as a standalone capacity to have linking to our societies, but it's also really a strategic enabler for a lot of other areas that wouldn't work in today's context if we didn't have these assets in space. So it's also the interplay with other areas that make it an important piece of the puzzle.
We've really made ourselves so reliant on things that go through space. I'd want to go to my last question, which would be, we've discussed these more tense situations, and I want to look for something a bit more optimistic. So if there is something that you're following with great enthusiasm, or an initiative or a latest development that gives you hope for the future of space or the EU's place in it.
I really like the way the EU space program is developing, with new elements being added that are also designed for security and defense purposes, that have also secure channels. So I'm excited about that. But that's work of the Commission. I'm just applauding it. In my own area of work, I'm enthusiastic about the work we do in the UN context with so many other countries worldwide that have the same objectives as we do. The partnerships that we have when we meet with those third countries, that's always, there's a buzz to that. So I really hope we can soon come to a few tangible measures and steps we can take. A couple of years ago, we worked together with partners, especially the US, for example, for a moratorium on anti-satellite testing from Earth in a destructive way. That now has already a very significant number of signatories. And these are really exciting things because they're practical, they're important. So I'm hoping in the coming years that we can find a few more of those and agree internationally to take them forward.
I think it's really, it must be a great joy as someone who works in an office to see that your work has very tangible effects.
It does, exactly. Yeah. And that is also because in the EES, we are, say, the diplomatic service of the EU. So we are constantly in touch with other states around the world, with the EU delegations in those states, with the UN context. And that is something that really energizes me, so that together with these other states, we can work towards something that is useful for all of us.
Thank you so much to Ambassador van Deelen for her perspectives. I know it's always very delicate to speak about geopolitical things like these. So thank you so much for this episode. And thank you for listening. If you'd like to interact with our episode, feel free to leave a comment. We're usually on LinkedIn and Instagram. We post there about the episode if you haven't already come from there. And you'll hear more from me in our next episode next Friday.